hope everyone is doing all right this evening. I am Jamarl Thomas. I'm your host. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, before I start today, because the content of this story is going to be completely demonetized as soon as the story airs, if you guys enjoy the content and you find yourself coming back to this site often, this page, this space, please consider supporting the content either through PayPal or Patreon. If you don't like either one of those, you can even mail it in. All of the information is below. If nothing else, please consider just subscribing or liking or sharing the videos also. That is my pitch. Now let's do the news. So, interesting story. There's a standoff that's taking place between the United States and Iran. Now, this standoff was already taking place because the United States was applying sanctions to Iran. But the ante has just been upped. We are apparently coming on the nearly year anniversary since Donald Trump pulled out of the Iranian agreement, the JCPOA. And Iran has come out and essentially said, we are not going to continue to live up to all of the tenets of the agreement. There are some tenets that we're pulling back on. Those tenets include the enrichment of uranium and the enrichment of heavy water. Or let's say the enrichment of uranium and the procurement, or it has to do with heavy water. I don't want to say enrichment of heavy water because I don't know if that's the right terminology, but essentially their heavy water facility and their enrichment facilities are going to go up. There's not going to be any number or any level that restricts them doing this. Now, they're giving the world community 60 days. They've essentially put the world community on 60 days notice that if the sanctions of the United States aren't eased up, meaning if the other countries aren't living up to the tenets of the JCPOA, that they will remove the restrictions on the enrichment, or you can say the enrichment of low uranium or low enrichment uranium. Yeah, low enrichment uranium and heavy water. That's somewhat of a big deal. And it freaked many of the other countries out. And I'm going to tell you about their response in a moment because their response is somewhat amazing. This story in and of itself is... Well, let's just talk about it. But I'm going to let them explain it first. This is Rouhani. Believe it or not, this guy was a moderate. I want to talk about that in a moment also.
ما در برجام توافق ما بر این بوده که غنیسازی در سطح 3/67 نگه داریم. از این اقدام خودداری میکنیم، یعنی سطحی دیگه برای ما مطرح نیست. و دوم اینکه راکتور آب سنگین عراق که بنا بود با مشارکت کشورهای 5+1 اون وقت در برجام نوسازی.
Now, here's the catch, and this is an interesting component. Nothing that they're doing at this point violates the agreement. Meaning, despite the United States' belligerence, Iran has still lived up to the tenets of the agreement, even now. Even as he says this about the heavy water and low enrichment, there's nothing in the agreement that prevents them from doing exactly what they are doing. It has to do with the amount. And they're saying if in 60 days you don't ease up, we're going over that amount. Now, let's discuss this for a moment because this is somewhat of a big deal and this heightens complications in the region. And I think I did the video the other day making this point that sometimes things that we don't necessarily foresee tumble us down the paths that we can't necessarily dig ourselves out of with a lot of bloodshed in the innovating process. If you remember, for nearly a decade, it may have been even more than a decade, a deal was negotiated with Iran to limit and curtail their ability to get a nuclear weapon. That was the entire point of the deal. The Obama administration believed that without this deal, it would lead to a larger war. It would lead to a larger conflict. And the JCPOA was looked at as a way of being an intermediary between those things, essentially to put a door or a lock on the door to prevent this kind of conflict, this larger conflict. And this was seen as a success, because to some degree it was. You had 7 other nations, essentially the world powers: China, France, the UK, Russia, let's say Germany, European powers, China and Russia, signed off on this. The only participant that pulled out of this was the United States. And you can't even make a case that says it was the United States, because ultimately it was Donald Trump that decided to pull out of the agreement. The American public was not necessarily on board for him pulling out the agreement. Nevertheless, he pulled out of the agreement. Everyone else agreed that Iran was meeting the requirements of the agreement. So this was on us. Despite all of the other European nations, including China and Russia, agreeing that Iran was meeting the tenets of the agreement, the U.S. passed sanctions. Now, here's the problem. If all of the other countries agree that Iran is living up to the sanctions and all of the other countries want to continue to abide by the agreement, one country says it's out. And it shows the weakness, the fecklessness, the lapdog status of the European countries, that when that one country said it was out, the sanctions kicked back in. And even when they tried to create that special vehicle that would have allowed payments to go through, even that, the companies were scared to do business with Iran because they didn't necessarily want to be penalized by the United States, even in other countries. That's the point I'm trying to get at. Meaning, U.S. policy in this case overrode the sovereignty of all of these other nations, because the companies and the businesses in these nations, despite what the governments wanted, bent the knee. They bent the knee. Unilateral belligerence. If you remember, and I don't know if all of you remember this, but this is within my political awareness, Rouhani took office as the moderate. Now, he took office as a moderate because there was, at least from the standpoint of our perspective, there seemed to be a presence of wanting something different as opposed to Ahmadinejad. Rouhani gets in office, and he's willing to do that deal against what the hardliners want. Now, this is the interesting point. He staked his reputation on this deal. Trump gets in office and bashes them. Not just bashes them, it's a horrible deal, and we need to get rid of this deal. And we're passing sanctions, and we're going to take their oil exports to zero. We're even going to take their minerals and all of these other things down to, X number of notches. I think they said 10%. We are going to hurt and make that economy scream. We're going to hurt the people in that country. We're going to try to topple that government by squeezing it in the same way that we've been squeezing Venezuela. It doesn't matter that they've been living up to the tenets of the agreement. Doesn't matter. This makes Rouhani look like a complete asshole. The hardliners have been saying all along that you can't do a deal with the United States, that you can't trust the United States, and Donald Trump comes in and says that is exactly true. What is Rouhani to do with this? He's doing what he can. He's doing tit for tat. If you're talking about game theory, tit for tat is somewhat, I guess, at least in immediacy, all you have at your disposal. It doesn't seem like the United States wants a larger war. Certainly Iran doesn't want a larger war. So there's a certain degree of brinksmanship that's taking place between the two. But let's be very clear on who initiated this. This is not Iran's fault. Mike Pompeo can say anything that Mike Pompeo wants. Mike Pompeo has already admitted to being a complete liar. The reality of it is, Iran was living up to the tenets of the agreement. All of the other countries validate that Iran was living up to the tenets of the agreement. And the United States takes this ball, goes home, applies sanctions. Europe can't do anything about it, and so the companies in Europe, for the most part, follow suit. Oil exports, they're trying to take them down to zero. Now, China essentially just told them kick rocks, but it's unclear on whether or not the trade deal that's taking place with China includes some provision on Iranian oil, meaning to not export Iranian oil. All of this stuff is up for grabs. All of this stuff is up for grabs. If your objective is less war, then the deal was in place. Because again, the original purpose of the deal was to prevent a larger scale war because it was assumed that Iran was trying to get a nuclear weapon. It's unclear whether or not they were trying to get a nuclear weapon. But why wouldn't they? You can't necessarily trust the U.S. The U.S. has been toppling one government after the next. After what was taking place with regards to Syria, Iran most likely would have been next, regardless of whether it was a Democrat or a Republican administration. And one of the enemies that is close friends with the United States, Israel, has a nuclear weapon. I understand that this is not necessarily about fairness, but let's just be very clear that this is not necessarily about the best interests of the Iranian people either. This is about domination. They want a docile, passive, broken state. They want to be able to control and run roughshod over the Iranian government. Part of the chaos that they've been trying to sow in the Middle East is to be able to control that area, this kind of geopolitical gamesmanship. The other countries were incapable of shielding Iran and living up to the provisions of the JCPOA. This is kind of the problem. Iran's point in this is, look, either you live up to the tenets of the agreement or we don't. Now, the other countries threatened Iran over this, meaning France, the UK threatened Iran over this. Now, understand what has been taking place. Iran has been living up to the tenets of an agreement. The other countries have not. And when Iran makes the point of, well, look, we're going to lessen and stop living up to certain provisions in the agreement, they threaten Iran. How are you threatening Iran? You are the ones that aren't living up to the tenets of the agreement. Under this model, under this thought process where you're going to threaten Iran in this way, we want you to live up to this agreement. And even though we made this agreement, we give you nothing in return. I just find this to be amazing. So the question becomes, what does Iran do? If they're trying to take oil exports down to zero, and there's a severe doubt on whether or not they can do that, there's a secondary question of whether or not Saudi Arabia can supply the oil necessary in order to keep the oil markets from going up. If I'm not mistaken, the price of oil has already gone up. If there's some kind of major conflict in that region of the world, that price could spike. The United States is an oil producer, that is true. But it's very possible that part of the United States foreign policy, this push to try to get its hands on Venezuela, is because it wants the oil from Venezuela that it can use to drop the oil price within regards to Iran. Meaning using the oil production in Venezuela as a weapon in order to hit Iran and undermine the stability of the Iranian government that much further. Not to mention, any shocks to the oil market at that point could be made up based on the oil that you're putting out through Venezuela. There's a reason that the United States has been attacking all of these countries in this way, meaning Venezuela and Iran at the exact same time, using similar, if not the exact same weapons, meaning sanctions and chaos and propaganda, in order to try to undermine and destroy the stability of those governments. Iran is threatened, at most, to potentially try to close the Strait of Hormuz. This is a small waterway that, if I'm not mistaken, 30% of the world's oil comes through. They have these kind of speedboats that they go through and control the straits. This would immediately provoke an action by the United States. Imagine a situation where a U.S. ship fires on some kind of Iranian vessels, in which case they return fire and they sink that ship. These are dangerous times. These are very dangerous times. I think that's everything. Europe has utterly failed in its capacity of supposedly protecting Iran for this deal. And it is utterly shameful that the belligerents of the United States can literally run roughshod over all of these governments. All of these governments, many of which used to be masters of the world, are now running roughshod to policy by maniacs. Pompeo, Bolton, I hate to tell you, are maniacs. And these guys are running the House. For all these people that was pushing this notion that Donald Trump was going to be better on foreign policy, it is true that he has not started a major war. Give him time. Give him time. He's headed in that direction. I'll end this here. I didn't want this one to go too long. And 10 minutes is right on time. If you guys enjoy this content, please consider supporting this content through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks, everyone. And this.